But without further ado, I'm really excited about this next panel. The name of our forum always was Merging Considerations in Maternal Mental Health. That's where we anchor. And this panel is going to be talking about emerging tests and treatments to address maternal mental health. Moderating this panel is Dr. Julie Fraga. She's a psychologist who specializes in maternal mental health, sees patients daily, and she's also a freelance journalist who's been going deep around gaps and cracks and crevices in maternal mental health and also novel solutions. So we knew of no one better to moderate this panel. She's also a journalist, a freelance journalist who's written stories on maternal mental health and mental health for outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and Time. And then lastly, I can't help but say that Dr. Julie Fraga was one of our first board members at 2020 Moms. So we're really grateful for her for so many reasons. And Dr. Fraga, so honored to welcome you to the main stage, and thank you for moderating this important panel. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Joy. It's so wonderful to be with everyone. We have a wonderful panel for you today, talking about emerging tests and treatments, including payments and policy levers, with some great panelists. And we're going to start with some introductions. And I'm so thrilled to introduce Dr. Cole Brown. Dr. Brown, can you just take a minute to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you. And I'm glad to be here today. I am Cole Brown. I am the Vice President of Medical Affairs at Sage Therapeutics. I've been with Sage Therapeutics for around 2.5 years. Prior to Sage Therapeutics, I went to medical school at Howard University College of Medicine in DC, did a short stint in internal medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, and have been in the biopharmaceutical world for a long time before joining Sage. And Sage is a biopharmaceutical company focused on improving the lives of patients with brain health disorders. So glad to be here today.
Thank you so much. And next we have Dr. Nicole Bush.
Hi, it's so wonderful to be on this panel with such incredible champions, and this whole conference is fabulous. Thank you for including me. I'm a professor at the University of California, San Francisco, or UCSF, in the departments of psychiatry and behavioral sciences, as well as the Department of Pediatrics. I'm also the division chief for the Division of Developmental Medicine. I am a mom of 2 young boys with a lot of energy, and I have a background. I'm a child clinical psychologist by training. I've worked in community psychiatric care settings and had a long-standing interest in stress biology and policies that might improve the well-being of our population. So I'm really excited to be here and share my work.
Thank you so much. We're so looking forward to hearing about your research.
Thanks for
Next,
having
we
me.
have Dr. Inava Court. Hi, Dr. Court.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I am an assistant professor and research scientist at Cedars-Sinai in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and also in the Department of Psychiatry. And I am the director of the reproductive psychology program. So like you, Julie, and you, Nikki, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I see patients as well as conduct research on risk factors for maternal mental health disorders. So thanks again for including me.
Great. And finally, Dr. Jennifer Payne.
Me. I am a psychiatrist and a clinical researcher. I am professor and vice chair of research at the University of Virginia. Prior to coming to Virginia about 1.5 years ago, I was at Johns Hopkins for 18 years. And much of the research I'm going to be talking about today took place there. I have a longstanding interest in postpartum depression and understanding the underlying biology for postpartum depression. And I'll be talking about biomarkers for postpartum depression today.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We're so excited to hear from everyone. I guess as a clinician myself, coming out of the pandemic and seeing just rates of maternal mental health concerns really skyrocketing in my patients, I'm so excited for us to have a discussion about emerging tests and treatments and ways to really push things forward and make things more accessible. So on that note, we're going to hear from Dr. Brown first about your great research.
Thank you so much. My presentation today is going to discuss really exploring the pharmacological treatments of postpartum depression. And if we go to the next slide, this is your typical background. I'm an employee of Sage Therapeutics and hold stock or stock options. And the next thing is intended use. So I think these are beautiful slides, but if you want to take pictures and put them in your Easter eggs, please don't. Keep them here, and they're not really for distribution. So if we go to the next slide, Dr. Bush probably knows this well. I have two young daughters. She has two young children. I have a 4-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old daughter. My daughter, Isla, she has what I call the Isla food groups. Those food groups are chicken nuggets, macaroni, pizza, and applesauce. That's all she eats, and that's it. And the reason I bring that story up is because I feel the space of pharmacology and neuropsychopharmacology has really been focused on monoamines when it comes to in terms of the treatment of depression, and focus on symptom improvement and labeling drug classes based on how they improve those symptoms and what disease states they improve. So we have a class of antidepressants, which include, SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SNRIs. There's atypical antipsychotics that are in the group of antipsychotics because they were initially used to treat schizophrenia and other types of psychosis. So these groupings were really based on disease modalities and less so mechanism of action. And unlike my daughter, who's still eating nuggets and macaroni and pizza, the field is moving. And there is an awareness that there are multiple pharmacotherapeutic targets in depression. Whether it is looking at mu agonism and the impact that opioids can have, or the interest in psychedelic compounds like psilocybin and their use in collaboration with therapy in order to improve depressive symptoms. There's also an understanding that the fundamental role that GABA and glutamate play, the interplay between excitation and inhibition, and how high levels of a lack of inhibition and failure to really regulate excitation through glutamate has and may underpin the pathophysiology of depression. Really understanding that depression is more than just monoamines. There's a level of brain network dysregulation, and there's a dysfunction in key areas of the brain, such as the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, that connection, that circuit between those systems, a certain degree of dysregulation. And the field is starting to recognize that there may be a multitude of ways to address that. And that's what this slide represents, how the field has evolved. And this isn't all encompassing. There are lots of therapeutics under investigation. And this is just to highlight that the field is moving, that there's an understanding that there's a need for novel treatments and an opportunity to focus on how different mechanisms of action can treat depression. So if we go to the next slide, this further highlights that. So if we think back into the 1950s, there was the discovery that imipramine led to improvements in depressive symptoms. And as I mentioned before, that led to a belief that the pathophysiology of depression was really driven by a depletion of monoamines. And that remained the focus. There were additional agents that came after. We had MAOIs. We had, the development of different types of tricyclic antidepressants. And that led to the evolution into SSRIs. SSRIs were seen as an evolution in terms of safety, maybe not in terms of efficacy, but the side effects of TCAs, they're a bit like a shotgun, and they're impacting multiple systems, lead to anticholinergic side effects, significant degree of sedation. SSRIs were seen to lead to lesser safety issues, although maybe not more efficacious, but it was seen as a great triumph and something that HCPs really jumped on to help their patients. And I bucket both SSRIs and SNRIs together, although SNRIs came a little bit after. Now the field, as I mentioned, is evolving to recognize there are other drugs that can be approved in other modalities. As you see here, there's now an approved neuroactive steroid for the treatment of postpartum depression that is currently on the market. So there's a recognition that there's other ways to treat depression, and particularly postpartum depression. And the use of neuroactive steroids really stems from what my colleagues here on the panel will be talking about a little bit later, but the hormonal dysregulation that occurs during pregnancy that leads to decreased levels of allopregnanolone and a lack of increase in GABA A receptors in that postpartum period, which we believe really drives the development of postpartum depression. And at Sage Therapeutics, we believe by impacting those neuroactive steroid systems, we're able to impact the lives of patients with postpartum depression. And that's really the focus of my presentation today, and what we wanted to get across is that the field is evolving, moving, growing, and new agents are coming along to help mothers and their families who suffer from depression.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. This is so promising and just so really, exciting to hear about what you're working on in terms of a treatment specifically for PPD. Where are you at right now, Sage Therapeutics, in the development of this treatment?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I appreciate it. So we have one approved compound, Zulresso, which is indicated for the treatment of postpartum depression in those that are 15 and older. We also have, and this is an IV infusion compound. We also have a compound under investigation that has received priority review by the FDA, and we're looking at approval, a PDUFA date, so Prescription Drug User Fee Act, so FDA approval, in August 5th of this year for zuranolone for the treatment of both postpartum depression and major depressive disorder.
Great. And will these medications be covered by insurance in terms of accessibility to, those who are struggling?
So yeah, to answer that question first, I did leave out that zuranolone is an oral agent. So Zulresso is an IV infusion, zuranolone is an oral 14-day treatment. We are working really closely with the right teams here at Sage to make sure that we're having conversations with payers. We understand that clinicians have access concerns given this current state of the clinical landscape. And we've been having really good, thoughtful conversations with payers. I can't speculate at what will happen after approval, but I can say that they understand the unmet needs for this patient population, in particular for those with postpartum depression. And we've been having really positive conversations, and we hope that at launch we'll be able to address those access concerns.
Great. Thank you so much. We look forward to hearing more, and this is just such promising developments.
Thank you.
Yeah. And next, Dr. Nicole Bush, we're excited to hear from you and hear about your research.
Great, thanks. Today I'm going to tell you about a series of studies that our team conducted with pregnant people and their babies, and the results give us a lot of hope. And although I'm the presenter today, I really want to highlight that this work is the result of a collective of hearts and minds of a broad group of incredible individuals, particularly those highlighted on this slide. Next slide. So I'm going to share some findings from our Mindful Moms training, which is an 8-week group-based wellness promotion intervention we conducted during pregnancy. It was adapted from a series of existing interventions that are evidence-based that have shown promise for improving eating and stress and mood outcomes. And the sessions were adapted to be 2 hours long and focused on developing acceptance-based emotion regulation skills. And it was activities such as mindful meditation, mindful movement, nutrition didactics, as well as mindful eating discussions and activities. Things such as if women identified themselves as stress eating and eating a bag of chips when they were anxious or feeling really angry, we talked to them about recognizing those emotions, thinking about all the different ways they might cope with that stress and arousal in more healthful ways, such as going for a walk, calling a friend, doing some breathing exercises, or choosing a healthier food option to meet that craving. And those are just a few examples of the kind of things that were involved in this group-based intervention. The intervention was delivered by a pair of trained professionals, and these ranged from master's level students to certified nurse midwives and family nurse practitioners. Each of them had experience with facilitating mindfulness-based health interventions, as well as experience working with pregnant people and new moms who matched our target population. Our target population was from the San Francisco Bay Area and inclusive of low-income women experiencing high levels of stress and seeking support during their pregnancy. And they were trained and supervised by, the interventionists were trained and supervised by a PhD level intervention developers, and in particular, Cassandra Beaton, who led the intervention component of our study. And this group-based class format required enrolling women in the same stage of pregnancy. And for us, we were targeting 12 to 20 weeks of gestation, and women who met eligibility criteria but couldn't make the night or time of the class, and also women who were just a little bit outside the enrollment window, maybe gestational weeks, 20 to 23 weeks, were put in a treatment as usual control group. And the treatment as usual included prenatal medical care that the individuals would have received on their own regardless, and women with elevated depression were provided with resource lists or referrals if they wanted to seek support. And therefore, the treatment as usual group and the intervention group both received medical care as usual, with the difference being that the treatment group received the Mindful Moms training. Next slide, please. So the study to evaluate the effects of this intervention during pregnancy was led by Dr. Alyssa Epple at UCSF, and we were really happy to note that women who were enrolled in both the treatment and the control group were well matched at baseline on key demographics, but also they had equivalent levels of stress and depression at baseline. However, we were thrilled to find that there were significant reductions in stress and depression at the end of the 8-week intervention. And you can read about those initial pregnancy findings in Dr. Epple's 2019 paper. I was fortunate to be able to fund the follow-up study of the women and their babies through age 8. Next slide. And strikingly, we found that those initial reductions in depression that were significant were sustained for 8 years after the intervention ended. Even during the pandemic, that last time point you see at the end where there's an uptick, where, as Julie noted earlier, there's this national increase for everyone in depression, but in particular mothers with young children. We saw that our sample also had increases in depression across the sample, but note that women in the intervention group still had lower depression than those in the treatment as usual group. So this really increased our confidence that these are true intervention effects that are responding to population changes, but also maintaining despite that increase. Next slide. And really compelling to us is that this happened even during COVID, and that it was clinically significant differences. So less than half of the women in the intervention met criteria for moderate to severe depression, 12% relative to 25% in the treatment as usual group. And that difference was pretty consistent across the entire 8 years, but really potent to us that this occurred during the stressor of the pandemic. Next slide. And importantly, especially to me, because I work with women and families and children, but I'm very interested in the 2-generation effects of these interventions, we found, we're really excited to find effects on the babies. We conducted standardized experiments with babies in both groups. We hooked them up to EKGs and conducted these stress paradigm tasks so that we could get them aroused and concerned and then help them recover. And what we noted is that infants in the treatment as usual group, when they were compared to the intervention group, they showed a delayed fight or flight response in their sympathetic nervous system to the challenge. You want an activation of your stress response system in the response to a stressor, and then you want to recover afterwards. And babies in the intervention group responded appropriately and then recovered well after the stressor when having their reunion with their mother. And babies in the treatment as usual had a delayed reaction and then didn't recover fully. We also coded their behaviors, and we found that babies in the intervention group had less negativity and better self-regulatory behaviors. And all of these outcomes we found differences in are related to all sorts of important behavioral and emotional functioning outcomes in childhood and frankly later on in adulthood. So we're thinking these are important positive impacts on offspring wellness that may last and be sustained across the life course. Next slide. So I mean, the key takeaway for us is that these psychosocial interventions that increase maternal wellness and reduce distress during pregnancy are really worth the investment. These are relatively low-cost interventions, and they had really powerful sustained effects and effects for both generations. And so we are really hopeful with this finding. We also like to note that it would be wonderful to prevent the excessive stress and risk for depression in these communities and populations. And of course, many of the panelists in other groups have been talking about this. We have to address the root causes, inadequate access to resources, housing, et cetera, prevent violence, and make sure that women have the care they need. And yet, if they're in a position where they need these types of supports, we're feeling really excited about the opportunity that a psychosocial intervention can be really useful. Next slide. And I want to acknowledge the people who made this research possible. And in particular, we have the PI of a lot of the research there, the principal investigator, Alyssa Epple, and our colleagues, Nancy Adler, Barbara Laraya, and Cassandra Vieten, and then also the two first authors on the papers of the findings I presented here today, Danielle Rubinoff and Amanda Noronha-Zhu, and our incredible team. We also have a wealth of donors who have supported this work, both at NIH level, but also philanthropy, and it's been thrilling to partner with all of them to move this work forward.
This is so exciting. I mean, I think I have more questions than I have time for today to ask you about your research, but it seems also just in hearing about your presentation that this is not just an intervention for pregnant people. This is an intervention for family wellness.
Yes.
And would you say, I'm just honing in on what you were talking about when you went and you looked at the babies and how they were responding. I don't know if you did any, questionnaire at the outset with the participants in terms of current trauma, past trauma, but it seems also like this is an intervention that can really help prevent the, passing on of intergenerational trauma that can so often be a correlate in maternal mental health concerns that doesn't get maybe the same airtime.
Yeah, it's really striking. I have a whole body of research. Thank you, Julie, for mentioning that. We have a whole body of research from our team really showing that histories of trauma and adversity do affect the individual exposed to it, but also cross the generations to affect children. And even maternal histories of childhood abuse in her own childhood are showing effects on child mental health of her offspring. So we're seeing mom's own childhood adversity carrying forward into child mental health outcomes. And that's been really striking. People say, oh, we kind of know that in our hearts, but there hasn't been data until very recently to demonstrate that. And our population had really high levels of exposure to adversity historically and during pregnancy, remarkably high exposures of stressful life events. And so we know it works well with this community and population. I think there's a lot of women of high income who have had a lot of history of adversity and violence and interpersonal challenges, death of a loved one, et cetera. So it's a universally useful intervention, we think, for people experiencing stress, but we find it's particularly powerful in this community that had a lot of social disadvantage and probably a lot of structural racism and structural determinants of health.
Right. The other promising aspect is I just know as a clinician that right now we're in a mental health crisis in the sense there are not enough therapists for the amount of people who need help. There are not enough therapists that are accessible, affordable because of, just our healthcare system, the way insurance is covered, the way a copay is covered. This intervention seems like it's something that can be so therapeutic to so many. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're at in terms of making your program more accessible to moms across the country?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. We would love to work with others to take this intervention to scale and to try to improve access. Our funding for the project ended, but Alyssa Epple, who leads the pregnancy intervention research, has been considering how do we disseminate this. Mindfulness is increasingly popular. A lot of people are familiar with it, but this program has a unique combination of elements that are really targeting healthy cardiometabolic health, as well as the needs of low-income pregnant people. She's also considering how we might convert some of the aspects of the program to internet and app-based elements, but we don't yet have the data to know how effective the intervention will be without the in-person or community and group-based components. And we would love partners in this work to sort that out. In terms of your earlier question, it's a hot topic, and I know has come up a lot in this conference, is who might deliver this. These types of psychosocial interventions are ripe for delivery with an expanded provider class. These mindfulness practices and group wellness facilitation skills can certainly be taught to all sorts of approved provider classes, such as community health workers and doulas and peer providers with the proper supervision. And these groups actually might even be more effective when they're delivered by culturally congruent workforce that can center the lived experience. And we're glad to note that several of the practitioners in our intervention study did fit that description, but we haven't had the funding or the time to test how much that element matters for the effectiveness of the intervention. But our hunch is that it would be a particularly potent amplifier of effects if it's delivered by people who not only have the mindfulness group-based facilitation skills, but the ability to really relate and connect with these women, so the women feel seen and are met in the ways they want to be seen and communicated with.
Great. Thank you so much. That's so promising. I'm so excited about your research and to see how it moves forward. And it's certainly really groundbreaking in the sense that it's an intervention, not just for moms, it's an intervention for families. So
Thank you. It's
much.
great to be able to share it.
Thank you. And now we will hear from Dr. Enav Akwart on your research.
Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you, Nikki and Cole, for sharing as well. I think this is kind of a good segue into the next two presentations. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about my work with you all today. And so as you can see from the title, we set out to investigate whether there's a unique protein signal in patients with perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. And this is my team, and this paper has been published actually just last month. And I believe, Julie, it's already been shared, right? So the 2020 Mom sends out information to everyone. And so this is one of the links there. So you can read more about it. Next slide. But I will just share a little bit with you all today. Of course, understanding that our prevalence rates of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders are about 20%, but for individuals who have adverse perinatal complications like preeclampsia, or maybe have babies in the NICU. Certainly those who experience medical structural racism are at higher risk, up to 40%. So a new and improved paradigm is really urgently needed for early and accurate diagnosis. And this is kind of what's bringing me to the slide here, which is our methods. And so you can see that we prospectively collected serum from third trimester pregnant patients. We collected all kinds of information. I'm just sort of highlighting what I'm going to share with you today. We could talk offline, be in touch if you have questions about any of these other methods. But we followed these women through their delivery and then up to 3 months post-delivery, where we connected with them again in person, not just to screen them for symptoms, but also to collect another biosample. And I'm not going to share results from that today, but I think it's important to mention because one of the questions that I get often is, well, you're looking at prenatal biosamples. Do you know anything about what's going on in the postpartum? So just wanted to mention that here, but I'm going to focus on our prenatal samples from the third trimester. Next slide, please. What you're seeing here is a heat map of the top dysregulated proteins in plasma samples among our participants with perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, and then our controls, our healthy participants. And what you can see is that these upregulated proteins are in red and the downregulated proteins are in blue. And a protein expression was considered significantly dysregulated if the p-value was less than 0.01. And overall, you can see that a unique protein signature differentiated our PMAD cases from controls. I'm going to talk a little bit more. If you'll click ahead, I think it will be automated. Oh, maybe not. But what I'm focusing here on in this slide is a subset of our participants. So when we restricted the analysis to exclude preeclampsia, a 30 protein signature differentiated our PMAD cases from controls. And I'm highlighting here those that regulate inflammation in the red boxes. I think we need to move forward. This slide never, oh, okay, we're going back and forth. But here's what we're looking at, which is our subset of data. And you can see in the red boxes on the right, these are the proteins that regulate leukocyte migration, inflammation, and immune function. Next slide. So next, what we did is we validated our SomaScan results using quantitative ELISA and confirmed those results. So we didn't want to make any assumptions. We wanted to go ahead and confirm. And we saw, and I'm going to highlight for you here about beta-2 microglobulin, which showed greater, or the greatest separation, I should say, between our cases and controls. And it was upregulated in the cases, the individuals with perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. And what we know from previous research is that serum and plasma beta-2 microglobulin values have already emerged as markers for activation of the cellular immune system. We've seen that increased amounts in blood and urine may be a sign of certain diseases, including depression. Next slide. So in conclusion, this study highlights that there are dysregulated proteins that can accurately differentiate cases of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders from controls. And this provides some, initial information for future development of a biomarker panel for PMADs. We think it's really important to focus on certainly beta-2 microglobulin, but we'll need to do additional validation studies with larger samples to really determine the clinical utility of these markers for diagnosis of perinatal mood and anxiety disorder. So that's next in our agenda. Next slide. Thank you all so much for your time and your attention. None of this work could have been accomplished without the support that we received along the way. So I'm sharing that here and hope that you'll stay in touch. I did have at the bottom of the slide some contact information from me, but hopefully you can see that in the information that 2020 Mom provided. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Report. This is so interesting. And as somebody without a strong background in science, I'm just so interested and learned so much just from your presentation. My question is, how might these results, I know you said that you're doing some other studies, but in the future, how might this change how prenatal care is delivered?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. And I kind of liken this to the work that was done quite some decades ago, looking at gestational diabetes and trying to identify women or pregnant individuals who might develop gestational diabetes. And so there were several different tests years ago, and they were trying to figure out how can we identify women in advance. Obviously, then we can do all kinds of interventions with them, diet, exercise, stress reduction, and eventually meds, right? And I really and use this as an analogy to the work that I'm doing, which is trying to identify, is there a way that as early as possible in a pregnancy, we can identify a biomarker that would allow us to identify, well, this woman may be at risk. So let's go ahead and see, can we do an amazing psychosocial intervention like what Dr. Bush described? Do we need to do individual psychotherapy immediately? Do we need to move on to what Dr. Brown was sharing with Zulresso and the other medications, right? So ideally, as we all know, the earlier that we can identify women who are at risk, the better off we are. And quite frankly, we're behind. I mean, the gestational diabetes, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I can tell you that the downstream negative effects for women and their families is great for diabetes, for the fetus, for herself. But as we all know here, we're preaching to the choir. The risks and the rates of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders are nearly double that for gestational diabetes, and the outcomes are truly dangerous for our families and our moms. So that's why we're working hard to try to identify some of these biomarkers. And I'm excited to hear too what Dr. Payne is going to share, because as Dr. Brown mentioned, and there's all these different mechanisms, and we're trying to understand better that there's not a single cause explanation for postpartum depression. Similarly, there are going to be potentially different avenues for us to identify risk through biomarker research as well.
Thank you so much. It sounds also what's promising is I see so many women, with a maternal mental health concern, and they're just caught off guard by it.
Yes,
Their OB
precisely.
never really talked with them about it. They went to all these classes, but those are really about how to give birth, how to feed your baby, not really about your emotional well-being during pregnancy and the postpartum period. But then when you do an intake as a clinician, you scratch a little bit harder, into a background, a history, and you hear, oh yeah, I was really depressed when I went to college, or,
Yep.
oh, I forgot, I was really devastated when a family member died.
Yeah.
So you see these, hints of risk factors, but because the screening wasn't there, the mom herself didn't even know that she might have been more at risk. With your research, it sounds like we could perhaps one day identify everyone who's at risk, just like we can for gestational diabetes, and then intervene sooner.
Exactly.
So that's
Exactly.
really exciting.
It's for me, I see it as just a preventative effort, identifying women as early as possible. And yeah, you raise a good point. We do have some tools, in our toolbox. We know that personal or family history of depression or anxiety is a risk factor. But as you mentioned, the OB-GYN physicians aren't necessarily going into the chart and searching for that. And the patients aren't thinking about that time in college years ago when they were depressed. And so, we need to have something that's really, kind of an across the board screening tool that we can use. And I think fewer women will fall through the cracks because a lot of times, depending on the setting, depending on the individual, certainly for some of our patients, women of color will share that they might have been screened but didn't feel comfortable sharing their symptoms. And so a screening tool like this would allow us to really protect our patients and provide them with the care that they need as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm thinking just like if you test positive for gestational diabetes, right in the healthcare system, there is the next step in-house.
Warm handoff. We go straight to the nurse.
Interventions, more appointments. And it's so promising that, I could see Dr. Court, with your screening, then a handoff to Dr. Bush for her program.
Absolutely.
Somebody who was really still struggling, postpartum, a handoff, to Dr. Brown for your intervention. So all of these things working together to really identify, moms who are at risk, intervene sooner and reduce suffering for the whole family. So this is just so promising. And on that note, Dr. Jennifer Payne, we're so excited to learn about your research.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to share it with you. And I think Dr. Court's study is totally fascinating, and I think will perhaps someday be able to add to what I'm about to tell you about today so that we can capture even more women at risk. So today I'm going to talk to you about epigenetic biomarkers of postpartum depression. This is really describing a decade's worth of work on my part and my basic science partner's part, Zach Kaminsky. And I've kept it fairly high level, and there are more and more details if you dig deeper, but I really just want everybody to come away with the big picture here. So next slide, please. So I think we all here know what postpartum depression is. In general, postpartum depression meets criteria for a major depressive episode. About 50% start during pregnancy and then continue and usually worsen in the postpartum time period. And most of us think that at least some episodes of postpartum depression are triggered by the hormonal changes that occur through pregnancy and then again at delivery. And what you can see here, this is just a little slide showing you the tremendous increases in estrogen and progesterone, as well as allopregnanolone that occur during pregnancy that then plummet in the postpartum time period. Next slide, please. So what the heck is epigenetics? Epigenetics are actually heritable changes in gene activity, which are not caused by changes in DNA sequence. So we all know about genes and DNA. And basically, epigenetics are methylation and histone changes that determine which genes are expressed. So all of our cells have all the genes, have all of the same DNA. And what makes a liver cell different from a brain cell are epigenetic changes. So in each of those cells, there's different methylation patterns that determine what genes are turned on and what genes are turned off. And what's really interesting is that environmental exposures can induce epigenetic changes and change gene expression. And so what are environmental exposures? Well, they include things like stress, hormone exposures, and not just true environmental exposures like radiation, et cetera, but kind of internal exposures can change how genes are expressed. And so a decade ago, Dr. Kaminsky and I had a very hypomanic conversation in which we postulated that postpartum depression might be a result of epigenetic changes that are induced by the hormonal changes in pregnancy and then again, potentially in the postpartum time period. So next slide. So what we did was, first, we took a mouse and we exposed the mouse to estrogen to simulate the same levels that we would see in human pregnancies. And then we specifically looked at a part of the brain called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is thought to specifically be involved in depression. And so we looked at what genes were methylated in different patterns, either up methylated or down methylated by exposure to the estrogen, but only in the hippocampus. And then we cross-referenced those genes to samples of blood that I had taken from women that I very carefully characterized. And so I had followed women throughout pregnancy and into the postpartum time period. And in our initial study, these were all women with pre-existing mood disorders. And we saw them at each trimester of pregnancy and then several times in the postpartum time period. And we were able to identify 2 genes that were methylated in a very particular pattern if a woman developed postpartum depression. So initially identified in the mouse as genes that were changed by estrogen exposure in the hippocampus, and then cross-referenced and then to blood from humans. And women who went on to develop postpartum depression had a very particular methylation pattern. Now, these 2 genes are HP1BP3 and TTC9B, and we don't know what they do. We have some idea. There's actually a knockout model in a rodent of one of the genes, the HP1BP3, and those rodents, when they have children, will not retrieve their pups. So they have alternate maternal behavior. So we know it can affect maternal behavior. We know that these genes are modulated by hormonal exposure. But other than that, we don't know very well what exactly these genes do. And this slide in the bottom right corner, you can see that in women who develop postpartum depression have very different levels of methylation compared to those who did not develop postpartum depression. And to make a long story short, we have replicated this finding in now 6 different samples, including women without a pre-existing history of a mood disorder, in women who retrospectively are reporting a history of postpartum depression. Most recently, I partnered with a group in Israel who collected a sample there, and it replicated again. And in general, we have about an 80% accuracy of predicting who's at elevated risk for postpartum depression. So next slide, please. So our what's interesting is that our epigenetic biomarkers actually exhibit 2 different patterns for depression that develops actually during pregnancy and then continues postpartum versus those that are well during pregnancy and then get ill in the postpartum time period. As I said, they're about 80% accurate. Interestingly, positive biomarkers early in pregnancy predict depression later in pregnancy. So if we take blood in the first trimester, we'll see depression in the second or third. If we take blood in that third trimester, it predicts postpartum depression. And I'm really excited to announce that we are working with a startup company called Dionysus Health to bring the biomarkers to market, hopefully in the next year. And we're going to start with direct to consumer and work on the clinical data that we need to get FDA approval. But we are working very hard. I'm essentially running two jobs, my academic job and trying to get these biomarkers available to people. And I think there's going to be a lot more interesting work coming out of this. My hope is that we'll be able to screen for postpartum depression in the third trimester. About 98% of all pregnancies are screened for gestational diabetes. And it's only 6% of pregnancies that develop gestational diabetes. Whereas if we could get up to 98% screening, we'd be preventing 10 to 15% at least from the general population and higher levels in more vulnerable populations. And this could really change outcomes for everybody in the long run. So I'll stop there. Just want to thank everybody that's helped me along the way, which has been many, many people. And I'll be glad to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Dr. Payne. This is such interesting work. And my question is, you said you're working with Dionysus Health to bring this to market. What do you anticipate that might look like in terms of accessibility for pregnant women, insurance coverage?
Right. So, initially, it is unlikely to be accessible to everybody. And that is the sad truth. We looked at going through the FDA, and even that does not guarantee insurance coverage. We are working to get the price down into a very affordable range, so it will be available to a number of people. But we are also working on an app that would be free that also uses another technique that my partner, Zach Kaminsky, developed using natural language processing that can alert when someone is at elevated risk for postpartum depression, so that we have another avenue to really identify women, even if they can't afford the biomarker test.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, yeah, so I'm really excited because we applied to be in this contest through the National Institutes of Health. It's called the RADx prize. And the company itself, we just found out like night before last that we are now in the third round of this competition. And basically it's a narrowing of companies that are trying to develop a product. And so we are, in addition to making the biomarkers available, we are developing an app that has multiple modalities, but also has the ability to look at social media posts, listen to how speech is made, that can identify when someone is elevated risk for postpartum depression. So the free app, we're hoping, will offset the cost of the biomarkers. And eventually, we would like the biomarkers to be available to everybody and to be part of standard of care. That, however, is a long road with FDA approval and insurance negotiations. So we're hoping to get this available sooner than that, because I think with demand, that road may shorten.
Great. I have another question, and this might not even, maybe I didn't understand correctly. So if I didn't, let me know. But when you're talking about epigenetics and what can change, right, a gene, you were talked about stress, right? And that sounds like it can also be stress internally, but external stress.
Absolutely. So, what we know that when people have undergo a stress, there are a number of chemical changes in the body. So cortisol levels go high, allopregnanolone, which is a neuroactive steroid, is altered. And there's a very big difference between acute stress and chronic stress in terms of what changes in the body. And that also leads to immune system alterations, et cetera. And all of that can influence what genes are turned on and turned off, which means it uses an epigenetic mechanism.
So my thought is, we've come out of this very stressful time of the pandemic and people are still stressed. I have never seen so many struggling women, in my clinical career. Do you think that the aftershock of this recent stressor is going to increase risk even in somebody, let's say, that was stressed out during the pandemic, gets pregnant in 2024? Is that going to change maybe their risk that
So certainly if they remain stressed, I think it's likely. So one of my papers looked at the rates of self-reported depression symptoms before the pandemic versus after the pandemic. I partnered with a health app called Flow, and we showed a clear increase in self-reported depression symptoms after the pandemic. That was only increasing the longer the pandemic went on. So I do think that, clinically, I'm recommending that everybody really take big steps to try to bring down their stress level. And that can be different things for different people. But I think unless we get the stress under control, absolutely that will put women at elevated risk.
And my final question, Dr. Payne, is moving forward, do you see your test being part of even like preconception kind of planning, something that I might take even before I get pregnant to see what my risk might be? So I could plan, even maybe I start therapy, maybe I start a mindfulness intervention, in preparation for pregnancy, just like I take a prenatal vitamin.
So that is a great question. And the one thing that there is some hint in some of our work, and this is not published yet, that the epigenetic biomarkers may actually be not biomarkers only for postpartum depression, but for brain sensitivity to hormonal change. So that these biomarkers are likely to work in other types of reproductive depression, in which case, if a woman has that, they may pre-exist the pregnancy. And so we haven't done that study, so I can't tell you for sure. But if that is the case, then yes, it could be part of prenatal. Oh, you're going to be sensitive to times of hormonal change. Let's see what we can do to mitigate that for your pregnancy.
Great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Do you happen to know, I always just think also of anxiety. So many parents are anxious. So many moms have prenatal, postpartum anxiety. Or any of these interventions that you all spoke about today, how might they also intervene to help anxious mothers?
I'm happy to comment briefly on that. We did not specifically assess anxiety in a rich or complete way in that particular study. It's often correlated, at least, low to moderate in adult populations. I think what's notable is mindfulness and wellness promotion activities that were included in our group have been demonstrated to really reduce anxiety across populations. And so I think we might be able to make some inference that it probably has some nice impacts on those outcomes as well. And just given the comorbidity of anxiety and depression, the fact that we were able to reduce stress and depression, we're going to hope that it had a nice effect. But that's one of our goals, is to do a better, more comprehensive, mental health tracking across a range of outcomes to better understand how transdiagnostic the impacts are.
Great. Yeah, and I was going to add that in our research, we always screen for depression using the Edinburgh, anxiety, using the overall anxiety severity and impairment scale, and we assess for PTSD using the the impact of events scale, the IES. And so when I was talking about perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, I was referring to one or more, right? If you're above the cutoff for depression, anxiety, PTSD. And so we haven't really looked granularly at each one separately. We just, because we're looking at PMADs, we decided to include, you could have one, you could have more than one. And like Nikki said, you know, we often do see them kind of like together. If someone's high on the OASIS for general anxiety, they're likely going to be above cutoffs on the IES for PTSD. And then the depression will oftentimes be connected with the OASIS general anxiety as well. But the one thing that I was going to say, and thank you all so much, this has been such an interesting conversation. And I have so many ideas percolating now that I will probably reach out to each of you individually
Exactly.
to talk about how we can move forward. But, you know, I think it is really important to consider that we want to have interventions be easily accessible. And we have just a recently funded R21 through NIH looking at an app where we're providing not just psychoeducation, but stress reduction. And I don't want to get into the details of it here, but I think, Nikki, your idea of moving your program into something that would be more easily accessible. And then, you know, Jennifer, you mentioned yours app as well, I think is the direction that we may want to move in. And there's a lot of good research saying that the outcomes are just as good as those provided. So I know you haven't done that work, Nikki, with yours yet, but you know, a lot of the research studies are showing that certainly something like CBT and mindfulness-based CBT, when they do that online or virtual or through an app, it's really very effective. So I just wanted to share that and say it's exciting to think about doing that.
Yeah, I agree. One of the grants I have out there right now being judged and scored is really looking at mindfulness-based app in terms of increasing meditation in women at high risk, both those with the biomarkers and without the biomarkers. I really think the next step in my research is to be looking at prevention studies, because I think that's where we need to go. And I think that's true for postpartum depression. But what I'm excited about is that with biomarkers, we are hopefully going to be decreasing the stigma around psychiatric disorders, because if there's, you know, a test for a psychiatric disorder, you know, it's really hard to say that psychiatric disorders are different from medical disorders. And then moving towards prevention, think about, you know, if your mom's depressed when you're developing, your development is not normal. And we know that postpartum depression affects IQ and language development behavior. So if we intervene and prevent postpartum depression, we have better outcomes, not just for mom, but like Nikki showed, for the affected children. And I think that eventually translates to whole communities. And we could really decrease the rate of psychiatric illness across the board if we do this.
I agree, but I want to add one thing. There is a misconception that a depressed mom is not a great parent and her kid
That's
will
right.
be affected. And I want to just clarify one thing, is that it increases risk and it places that family at particular burden for not, you know, having a child with outcomes that are, you know, worse than we would like. But I do think there's quite a few moms with mental health challenges who are remarkable parents and their children have incredible outcomes. And so it's one thing we need to be really careful for when we're talking about these risks and the intergenerational transmission. We have data showing that really high stress in pregnancy predicts mental health problems in kids, but not for kids who have average or above parenting in terms of parent quality. So it's only half the population that has that risk. And, you know, you just have to be a good enough mom and it's offset. And so there's lots of stories of resilience and hope. And I know a lot of people with mental health challenges hear some of our stories and they get really freaked out about their futures and their children's futures. And we want to say there's lots that can be done. Some of the things we've talked about here on this panel, but also that many people with the right kind of resources and supports can really be incredible caregivers despite having mental health challenges. And so something for us to just keep in the conversation.
Thank
You're
you.
absolutely right.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
I think that's so important. I think it's such an important public service announcement because I think some of the stigma surrounding help seeking, at least for maternal mental health concerns, is what mother, what parent, how shame-filled to have a diagnosis of depression, of anxiety, to see a headline, you're scrolling through your phone that says, postpartum depression affects the stress and IQ of your baby for years to come. Even if there might be a thread of truth somewhere in that data, how does it affect the outcome in terms of the, mother seeking the help that she needs, her feeling around it? I mean, I think we could have a whole nother conversation or a panel about those kind of barriers that do affect maybe, treatment seeking.
I do agree, though, with what Dr. Payne mentioned about this research and biomarkers, and having a test like this would really decrease the stigma and would encourage women to seek out help once they've been identified. It's like, oh, I didn't realize that I had this biomarker. I can't control that, right? This isn't about do better, be better, right? It's just, this is part of my genetic makeup, and I'm not going to let it, deter me from getting the help that I need. So I really am hopeful about that.
I think it could fold it in more in the sense that just like diabetes can be something that happens when you're pregnant, preeclampsia, depression is something that can happen when you're pregnant as part of an unfortunate thing that might be a side effect.
And it doesn't make you a bad mom.
And it doesn't, you didn't do anything to cause it,
Right.
You didn't. So,
well, and related to that, I think some of the issues around billing are nicely paired with that concern, which is that if we're waiting until a pregnant person has a diagnosis of depression to provide our psychosocial group intervention, then that's a problem, right? We want to prevent it, first of all, to save lots of healthcare dollars, but also, social justice and ethics and values as a, healthy society. And then it's going to have 2-generation benefits, not just save, the payer for that mom. We don't want to wait until then. And California is doing some really nice things in this space around getting rid of medical necessity in some regards, not for everyone yet, not everywhere all the time, but those movements to not needing a diagnosis for this type of wellness promotion are the type of directions I think we need to go, particularly just like we have public health interventions and programs to try to prevent gestational diabetes. And we talk to people about wellness and health and eating and prenatal vitamins to prevent, neural defects and all these type of things. And so why wouldn't we provide at a universal scale wellness promotion activities, preconception, early pregnancy and throughout the perinatal period to offset risk of these health challenges?
It's so true because, brain health is health, and it's not often thought of that way. As we talk about gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, postpartum depression, perinatal mood and anxiety disorders are, very common. Some of the most common complications associated with pregnancy, but not often thought of that way. So if we can prevent or treat these disease states, there's mothers that could use the help.
Absolutely. And I was inspired just sort of similarly to what Nikki said, with the preventative efforts for women who might be, their A1C levels, they're pre-diabetic. So they start to give them that information and here's some suggestions. And so we developed at the reproductive psychology program at Cedars, a preparing for postpartum wellness class. And so we basically have every single individual who's going to be delivering at Cedars, over 6,500 women. They're all invited to be, it's a one-time class. It's not a therapy or support group, but it's information about exactly what we're talking about. How can we prevent it? This may not be you.
Yeah.
But you spend an hour learning about what you can do if it is your experience.
And then you're much more likely to check on your friends that are having babies,
Good
so
point.
like it creates a norm.
Yes.
And a
We
knowledge
wanna have
level.
the conversation. That's what we want to do. Open conversation.
That's so important, Dr. Court. And I've shared with Dr. Bush, facilitate some classes at UCSF. And years ago, I started a class called Emotional Self-Care During Pregnancy for the same reason, just, tending to your emotional well-being, making that part of just the normal conversation, even amongst partners, so you can check on each other. And I think that's just another piece of kind of prevention that we can provide that's so easy to access. And the tools, they're like these little wellness exercises that are are, not hard to incorporate then.
And they're easy to disseminate through things like social media as well. So, on that note, I am going to put my Instagram link in the chat box. If anyone wants to stay in touch, I do a lot of sharing and educating through my Instagram, and I think it's a great way. Also, I've developed some research collaborations that way as well. So hoping to stay in touch and continue the conversation, and encourage pregnant individuals and new parents to really get educated around this, because exactly like you're saying, everyone has said it may not affect you, but it could affect a family member, it could affect a friend. And so just getting educated around it is so critically important. And I really appreciate Sage and Dr. Brown, Sage's support of that education as well. You guys have really made that a priority.
Yeah, thank you. We've been really, really focused on trying to improve education and really trying to do that very broadly, and understanding that there's a number of healthcare practitioners, and to your point around making sure that people have support systems, and it's not just the mothers that have postpartum depression, it's everybody, so they can seek help, so they can identify their friends who may be developing symptoms. It's all of us helping each other so that we can address some of the societal ramifications that Jennifer was speaking to earlier.
Yeah. And what are the policies that allow people the time off work to go get these services and supports? What are, the wage issues and leave policies that allow people to take the rest they need to prevent risk of postpartum depression because they're going back to work 2 weeks after their baby is born? What are the large macro scale society level decisions that need to be made to create a safe and healthy place for people to gestate, birth, and recover physically and mentally from that hormonal roller coaster and, frankly, total transformation of their bodies that is sustained, particularly when people breastfeed. And so there's a lot of work to be done for us to think about investments at a policy level and at a payer level to make these types of things available early to prevent harm, but also save costs. And I think there's like a lack of tracking of the dollars. Sometimes it's because the data aren't strong enough, but there's a systematic review of 29 studies showing, perinatal mental health interventions are cost effective. And it's not even like a comprehensive data, available to really help us know how cost effective it is, but the data are already showing that it is. And yet the resources and the services and the opportunities and the reimbursement systems are not set up yet to capture that. So I feel like there's a lot of work to be done in this space and a lot of people doing the work. And so I'm really grateful to 2020 Mom for creating this panel and this conference for us to, engage in this dialogue and move us forward.
And on that note, I'm going to turn it back over to Joy for any closing remarks. Thank you all for such a wonderful panel. I really look forward to us all staying in touch and having another conversation about all of your work really soon.
Thank you,
Great.
Joy.
I think it was one of the most exciting panels on emerging treatments and testing that we've ever heard. So thank you all for your incredible contributions to the field. We're going to do our best at 2020 Mom to make sure that payers and policymakers know what needs to be done to increase access and make sure that your treatments and tests are available to the patient population. So thank you so much, Julie. Wonderful job moderating the conversation. Thank you all. And I especially wanted to say thank you to Sage Therapeutics as well for the sponsorship of the forum. Your ongoing support of our work and others in the field has been critical. So thank you all again.